Alright, so good afternoon everyone. Thank you for coming to for the last session for today. The title of our event is Indigenous Peoples and Green Transition, Defending Lands and Resources, and Advancing Just and Equitable Transition. So this event is being led by Right Energy Partnership with Indigenous Peoples, the Asia Indigenous Peoples Network on Extractive Industries and Energy, the International Accountability Project, and Community Empowerment and Social Justice Network. All right, so do we? I don't know if we have chairs. No, we'll live streaming. Sorry. Yeah. So as we all know, it is imperative, no? Is it? I need to speak louder. Okay. So as we all know, it is imperative now, no, for climate science is very categorical that we need to limit global warming, the average global temperature, warming temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And to do so, we need to make fossil fuels history. No, we need to transform our energy systems from fossil fuels to renewable energy systems. That is a very important part of hitting, no, or achieving the global goal of limiting global average warming temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But to do so, civil society, frontline communities are demanding that this transition should be just, equitable, and fair, and that this transition does not replicate or amplify existing systems of oppression and exploitative relations that have made frontline communities vulnerable to the climate crisis in the first place. So we have actually invited a number of speakers for our event. They represent civil society, they represent indigenous peoples, frontline communities that are most vulnerable to the climate crisis. So to begin, to give us an overview of the challenges and opportunities for indigenous peoples in the Just Energy Transition Agenda, we would like to hear from Praveen Shakya from the Asia Indigenous Peoples Network on extractive industries and energy. So take it away, Praveen.
Thanks, Ivan. I think we need a little bit more volume.
The sound is not moving.
But we really can't hear with the live stream here. Yeah, thank you, Ivan. While the issue of volume is being arranged, we hope that people joining us live can still hear us. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining us for this session on indigenous peoples and green transition. My name is Praveen, as Ivan has already said. I'm from Nepal. I belong to indigenous Newar people. We are the natives of Kathmandu Valley and surrounding areas. And in my role as the convener of Asia Indigenous Peoples Network on Extractive Industries and Energy, we have been working with indigenous defenders and their groups in 8 countries in Asia, particularly to support communities affected by extractive industries, extractive and energy projects. Specifically, particularly after I joined ABNI in 2023, one of the key focus of ABNI has been to expose violations of indigenous peoples affected by expose violations of indigenous people's rights in the context of extractive and energy projects. And for that, we have been making direct support through small grants to the communities and their defenders to respond to the community's needs, be that for capacity building or advocacy or even for defender security. So since late 2023, over less than 1.5 years, we've made 20 sub-grants across 8 countries or territories, and it's unfortunate, that most of those sub-grants are in relation to projects that are considered green transition or energy transition projects. No? Some of the examples are these. Some of the examples for the are with regards to the sub-grants that we have made, and this also presents the overview or the challenges that indigenous peoples are facing in the region with regards to green transition. Is that we have been working on these communities that are being supported are affected by hydropower projects, or let's say large-scale hydropower projects in Northeast India and Nepal, particularly my country, Nepal. These are communities affected by offshore wind energy projects in southern India. We have communities affected by mining of critical minerals, for example, copper in Indonesia, silica in Malaysia, and June will be speaking more about that too, and nickel in the Philippines. No? And then geothermal, we also have communities affected by geothermal plant expansion in Indonesia. So again, a lot of these projects that are considered green or energy transition are being harmful to the communities, no? And that basically gives the context for energy transition for indigenous peoples in the region, and begs to ask the question, like, is this energy transition and is this just? Then who is this who defines this energy transition, and who defines if this is just transition, no? And I think my colleague Robbie will definitely be speaking about this later. Indigenous peoples have organized summits or conferences on just transition at global and regional levels, and we have in the outcome documents of those conferences challenged the notion about what is just transition, no? And who defines just transition, or who defines green transition. So the challenges, as we have seen in the context of these projects, or in the context of learning working with the communities affected by these projects that I listed earlier, is that the first and key, foremost challenge is these energy transition projects are continuing business as usual. How coal was being mined earlier, now nickel is being mined the same way. How big large-scale hydropower dams were being implemented earlier, offshore wind projects or solar projects are being implemented the same way. So when I say business as usual, that's basically, firstly, weak impact assessments. There's lack of robust social impact assessments on indigenous peoples or their cultures, or if any impact assessment on indigenous peoples or their cultures. No? And secondly, and this is key, the business as usual approach is again, there's no respect of our free, prior, and informed consent with these energy transition projects. Free, prior, informed consent is still an ideal or a principle yet to be respected. As a result, the experiences of indigenous peoples have been that there is continued displacement, there's continued dispossession of our lands and resources, and when communities are fighting back against these projects, there are reprisals against our defenders, against our leaders. And yeah, more concerningly, the projects and the project implementers as well as the authorities are using the tactics of divide and rule, which is leading to community disintegration, which is basically challenging the basic tenet of being indigenous, which is a collective identity. What we have also seen, particularly with in the context of the energy transition projects, the geothermal plant in Indonesia, and the silica sand mining case in Malaysia, and also the large-scale hydropower project in Northeast India, is there are specific impacts on women and youth. Yeah, women defenders or women leaders of the communities are being sexually harassed when they are leading the protests, or when they are in the front line of the protests. They are being harassed by the police. They are being harassed by the goons of the project implementers, and the youth, are also being demotivated, and to live in their communities, because these projects are basically pushing them away from their communities, because they are losing their lands and they are not being able to defend their lands. Yeah? So those are the experiences. And again, of course, it's not the exhaustive list. And specific with regards to energy transition projects, and this is key, is the issue that these energy transition projects, or in the name of energy transition, the challenges are being presented as solutions. The challenges for us are being presented as solutions. An example is, again, from my own country, whereby the government and development actors, including World Bank, development actors such as World Bank, Asian Development Bank, are pushing for large-scale hydropower projects or cascade hydropower projects. Hydropower is seen as the means of prosperity in Nepal and often shielded from any criticism. No? So if you are opposing a hydropower project, the community or the defender is easily tagged as anti-development and anti-national. And and this is a continued challenge for indigenous peoples. Finally, this is a continued challenge for indigenous peoples in Asia, that most states in Asia do not recognize indigenous peoples as distinct groups with established rights in international human rights law, including to our lands, territories, and resources, and to our self-determination. So our rights in our lands are still dependent or still conditional to what is being written in the law. So what we are doing in the face of these challenges, firstly, we are fighting back. Of course, we are not staying idle or taking it at the face value. We are fighting back in the courts. We are fighting back at the national level. But I think one of the key approach that many communities in Asia are taking, and in the cases of communities that we are working with are taking, is to leverage the investors, particularly the multilateral development banks. An example would be the indigenous Magar communities in Western Nepal who are affected by, who are going to be inundated by the Tanahu hydropower project, which is co-financed by the Asian Development Bank, European Investment Bank, and Japan International Cooperation Agency. They have filed complaints with both ADB's accountability mechanism and EIB's complaint mechanism. So they are taking their fight to the level of the investors. The same with the indigenous Pocholiok community in Indonesia. They have taken their advocacy to the KFD, the German Development Bank, that is financing the expansion of the geothermal power plant with the Indonesian power company, the state-owned company. At the same time, hopefully with our allies and with our support groups, we are also trying to do a lot of policy advocacy and even try to influence the policies or standards of the business associations. For example, there is increased engagement with associations such as the International Council on Mining and Metals. We have been trying to engage with the Initiative on Responsible Mining Assurance, but these are again long fights. Yeah. Finally, the other opportunity that we are seeing and we are promoting, and again Robbie will speak more to it later, is to promote indigenous-led solutions. We have seen these in Malaysia at a very significant scale. We are doing it in Nepal to a smaller extent, and Right Energy Partnership has been trying to promote it across the region. So in Nepal, the network that I lead, Community Empowerment and Social Justice Network, have been working with remote marginalized communities to implement their own indigenous-led renewable energy and low-carbon energy solutions. So these are micro-hydro projects, include improved cooking stoves, as well as solar irrigation projects. Just to give, this is basically to give an idea to the government how community-led development should be done, with the ownership of the community, with the real impacts on the community level. So I think that's basically the challenges and opportunities. I'll stop there for now. I think we have some calls that I will come in later with. Thank you, Ivan.
Thank you, Praveen. So basically, Praveen gave us, an overview, general picture of this green transition in the context of indigenous peoples and frontline communities. It's more and more looking like green colonialism, where in the name of sustainability, energy transition, indigenous peoples are being displaced, their rights of indigenous peoples are being violated, and even cases of sexual harassment against indigenous women have been documented. So that's the general picture. The general picture is, these are the challenges indigenous peoples are fighting back, through persistent struggles, and also through their own solutions. And more of these will be given to us by our fellow panelists. But to give us, a specific case study, faced by indigenous peoples in Malaysia, we have June Mary Robis to talk about, a case study on silica mining and its impact on women in Malaysia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Oh, yes, I see. We have to speak up a bit.
Yeah.
I'm just going to go straight into it. So Malaysia is rapidly expanding its mining sector under National Mineral Industry Transformation Plan 2021 to 2030, focusing on 5 strategic minerals, silica sand being one of them. So these minerals feed green technology, solar panels, EVs, and they're seen, they're touted as the new sources of growth. But as Prabin has pointed out, this economic drive has outpaced governance with serious implications for indigenous rights and environmental safeguards. And I'm going to go straight into a case study in Sabah, in Kudat, northern Sabah, about a 2 billion ringgit silica mining project by Kiben Group, which is a Chinese investment group. It aims to extract high purity silica near Bangau Beach, adjacent to a national marine park. So this area is ecologically sensitive and home to the Rungus indigenous community whose villages surround the site. And the communities, these indigenous peoples use the Bangau Beach for fishing, gathering shellfish, and cultural practices. However, the project has begun with minimal consultation and no free prior informed consent. So communities have been fenced out of ancestral fishing grounds, and women have even been charged with trespassing on their own customary lands. And they put up banners, they protested, we're not trespassers, Bangau Beach is ours since our ancestors. So their livelihoods are being eroded, fishing access is no longer there. There's security concerns around outsiders coming in, social tensions, and psychological trauma are also emerging. And these reflects a deeper problem where customary lands are not formally recognized, leaving indigenous communities like the Rungus groups vulnerable to dispossession. So I wanted to speak a bit about environmental red flags as well. There was a stream of blackish runoff that was spotted flowing into the sea in 2023, which was previously unseen by communities, likely due to the land clearing. So despite official claims that this was natural, conservationists point to hydrological disruption and risk to marine ecosystems. So silica dust, which is a byproduct of processing, is hazardous, and it raises long-term respiratory health risks for local residents. So as I mentioned, this project sits near protected mangroves and a marine park, which directly undermines Malaysia's biodiversity commitments and also disrupts women's livelihoods and roles. So I'm just going to go a bit more on the women's perspective. So for many indigenous communities, as we all know, the women's are, they are the guardians of the daily subsistence. So the Rungus women in particular are key providers through shoreline foraging, fish drying, mollusk collection, and they're managing the food economies. So these tasks are not just economic, but deeply tied to identity, memory, and intergenerational knowledge. So since the mining began, access to their beach has been fenced off. Women have been criminalized, charged with trespassing, while trying to continue their own practices. So obviously these are gendered impacts and environmental risks. And silica dust, as I mentioned, it disproportionately affects women and children who spend more time near homes and community spaces. And the concerns over water contamination and marine ecosystem loss directly hits women's food security responsibilities. And there's also the presence of unfamiliar workers has raised safety concerns, especially for girls and young women in isolated villages. So women are often the first to notice ecological changes, the shifts in water clarity, fish behavior, or mangrove health. However, the warnings are seldom included in formal EIA assessments. And of course, the absence of women, not just community representatives in decision-making. The Kudat project proceeded without free prior informed consent, which is a failure in itself. But of course, notably, women are not consulted at all, despite being the primary users of the affected beach areas. And these reflects a broader pattern. Women are often excluded from negotiations, yet disproportionately bear the consequences. Now, my colleague, Vanila Simbang, who has given me the blessing to share these findings today, and the Indigenous Peoples Network of Malaysia that I support as well, they've continually called for transparency, but as well, women's voices need to be formally and structurally included in all future ethnic processes. So I just want to end it by saying that this Kudat case is not isolated in Malaysia. So we have similar issues in the rest of Malaysia of rare mining, in rare earth mining in Perak, in a different state of Malaysia, bauxite in Pahang and Johor, and tin and silica mining elsewhere. So these are common governance failures. We have OPEC EIA processes where reports are not made public, there's limited consultation, no legal ethic. So we've endorsed UNDRIP, Malaysia has endorsed UNDRIP, but it hasn't been embedded in law, and there's weak indigenous land protection. So customary land often lacks formal recognition, and often state concessions override community use. And I think I'll end it from there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was less than 10 minutes actually. Thank you, June, for giving us the perspectives of indigenous women in Malaysia. We know for a fact that indigenous peoples are most affected by these projects, but it's actually more felt, felt by indigenous women. But to give us, more examples of how, these green energy transition projects are affecting indigenous peoples, we have also invited our friends from South India, Pranab and Vikram, to talk about the impacts on indigenous peoples of the Harvey Anglong Solar Power Project. So, who would like to go first? Vikram.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you so much. I'm Vikram Hanse. I'm from Assam, and particularly representing India. I belong to a tribe called Karbi, and we are totally affected people in the solar project. That is the Karbi Anglong solar power project, which require more than 18,000 because that is 25 acres of land, 25 acres of land, 100 acres of land of those indigenous peoples. So our concern to the project is that the indigenous people are displacing. That is not the first time it has been displaced. There has been several displacement for several projects, but this time the Karbi Anglong solar project, which is a huge project which require the very maximum land, and that land was particularly the indigenous land, which they have been there for the thousand years. And then the life and their agriculture and their sustenance and their livelihood totally depend on their land. So now the ADB has funded for the project, but we have read several about the ADBs and their modalities and then the results, but so far we have not seen effective in the ground, in reality. That's why we have came here to speak out on behalf of the affected people, as well as in my own places, that this project should be stopped. Otherwise, the people will be totally lost. Not only that, life of the people, but it will affect more to the environment also, because there will be the forest clearance as well as the cutting down, and the land developing will be there when the project is established. So from the point of view from the affected people, the project must be stopped so that those people who has been there for 1,000 years, they could survive. One point that need to be very noted is that to bring out the green energy and to displace the indigenous people is not a solution. In the name of development, government of India has been taking many projects in the tribal areas or indigenous areas where they are really affected. When the ADBs and the CRP groups visited the location, we have shown the areas how it is, but they could not respond well to our their visit. So we feel that ADB will take a serious note on this, and then the people will be justified when they stop the project, because there are certain local laws. I mean, there are certain laws that entitle to that area also. In India, it is a big country with a constitution, and there in the tribal area there is also a constitution called a mini constitution, which empower the land rights, which empower the customary rights to be practiced as it is by those indigenous fair. But that was not considered, and it was overlooked by the government as well as the ADBs. So in future, we are very hopeful that ADB will take serious note that the people will have justice on that ground. Thank you.
Thank you.
Should I add on?
Yes.
So I will just add on to what my friend and colleague Vikram Hanse has spoken. He's from the immediate community that's going to be majorly affected by the solar power project, which they claim to be a solar power park, the word that is used for renewable energies park. I think in itself it's very demeaning to the communities who reside in those areas. And the exact figure is more than 20,000 people will be directly affected by this solar power park, and Asian Development Bank is the major investor or the financer or funder for this project. And in the process of like how they have decided that this project will come up there, so when we undertook an analysis of all the documents which they accrued, which was the supportive documents of the reasons why they chose the place, and we found like major loopholes in the whole process. The basic fundamental thing I would like to bring to notice is during the whole process of when the surveys or the scientific studies that were done, never for once were the public consultations done in a democratic manner. And we have found photographs of consultations which definitely do not represent the 20,000 plus affected communities who needs to have a voice in this whole case. And also the environmental concerns, like here like we see a direct violation of the free prior informed consent, because you have like these voluminous documents, but the basic minimum share of communities who should be represented there are missing. And when we go to talk about this missing cases, then we find that they say that they claim that, oh, we have done this, our agencies have done. I mean, I think there needs to be a system of where Indian government did have a more robust and a more democratic way of taking public consensus or public consent, which was like 70% of the people in the affected communities have to agree to any kind of a proposal, only then it can move ahead. But here in this case, 70% leave aside that not even 2% of the people have been consulted or have consented to the whole project. And the other big violation is the environmental concerns. So clearly the environmental laws in countries like India are being discarded for the sake of exploiting the last surviving spaces or territories which are still mostly dominated by indigenous or local farming communities. And in this case as well, like there has been no environmental hearings or public hearings with the communities. I think more than the experts who we don't know who the experts are who have collated the documents, the people who reside there are the best experts to tell the Asian Development Bank or the fund implementers what is the ecosystem there, what are the wildlife or what are the flora and fauna that exist over there. and this has not been taken into consideration. So as a result, what has come up is like they come up with a report which says that this area is a degraded land, it's a wasteland where communities don't use the land. But they should fundamentally understand that the life world of indigenous communities is not only exploiting environment or nature for their own benefit, but to keep it alive so that like they can stay alive, because it's a more complex and a nuanced way of engagement with its surrounding. But here they have missed all these points, and so they have claimed that this is like a forest, so I mean communities are not cutting it down, that means they don't own it. But we have not cut it down so that it can protect us, it can protect our environment, but that was never taken into consideration, and they have come up with this very vulgar term called wasteland or degraded land. But there is much more science to it, how communities have survived there. And the Indian constitution in itself, like Vikram said, 6th schedule has a provision where it gives the right to self-determination for communities to govern themselves. And Karbi Anglong, where the solar power project is coming up, is one of the first region or territories that was given the right of the 6th schedule of the Indian constitution, which gives them the complete authority to govern their land in their own capacity or in their own genus. But here, like this was never taken into consideration, and so they see, like here, customary rights gives us the traditional rights to have our own land. But here they're asking us for documents, and the documents are modern systems of disposition, which, if not implemented well, can leave out most of the people. And that is exactly what has happened in this case. So the whole customary system has been violated. As a process of this whole thing, I feel the international financiers should also be taking the responsibility here and acknowledging the fact that by undermining constitutional or national safeguards, are they not also trying to break down nation states and just see economy as the whole aspect of governing things? I think like we need to have a more stronger apparatus where everyone has equal rights to have their own worries and concerns that need to be reflected in the process of going through or going about this big projects. And it can only be just, I feel, if the directly impacted communities are given the first right to have a say on the whole implementation of any project that would be coming up there. And renewable energy, I don't know how it's called renewable or why it's called renewable, as in that has to have a more detailed debate and discussion over it. If hydropower, water flowing away can be called renewable, I don't know how. And if biomass being burnt away by cutting down century-old ancient forest to build fuel can be called carbon-free or renewable, or even solar power by cutting down 24 square kilometers of forest areas and putting up panels, which will permanently affect the environment to maybe 100 square kilometers, or change the wind pattern, change the rain pattern. How can it be called renewable or green? I mean, these are big questions that need to be addressed. It's not that people don't know about it, but it needs to be addressed. And maybe I'll close my remarks with here. Thanks for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Bikram and Pranab. So definitely we will hear more from our friends. We have actually a lot of time. Thanks to our previous speakers for staying on time. But from what is clear to me is that many of the negative impacts and harms of development aggression projects, that we have seen in the past are being seen also in these so-called green energy projects, green energy transition projects that purport to serve the environment, the climate, and the root cause actually is of these negative harms is the disregard, the great disregard, no, and of indigenous people's rights and the lack of participation, genuine, meaningful participation of indigenous peoples in all relevant levels of decision making, no, project design, monitoring, etc. But we all know that these energy projects are also being financed, no, by many development actors, especially multilateral development banks, private sector. So we would like to learn more about the energy financing trends from our friend from International Accountability Project, Alessandro Ramasotti.
Thank you, Ivan, and thanks everyone for here today discussing these important topics. Yeah, I'm speaking on behalf of International Accountability Project. It's an organization that tracks multilateral development banks financing investments, including in the energy sector. And 2 years ago, we launched the Energy Finance Tracker, which is this tool to track multilateral development banks' investments in energy. And yeah, it revealed interesting patterns, including in relation to the topics that we are discussing today. It's very hard to understand when a project has impacts on indigenous peoples just by looking at the data. But what I did was to look at the risk categorization that banks assigned to the projects that they financed in Asia. More than half of the projects that were financed by MDBs in Asia during the period between January 2022 and March 2025 were assigned a high risk category or medium risk category, that is like category A or B. That's more or less like more than 150 projects were assigned a high or medium risk category. Yeah, apart from these, like in East Asian Pacific, to give specific figures, there were 136 projects funded by all multilateral development banks, and 69 of these were categorized with a high risk category. In South Asia, it was 85 projects out of 160 that received a high risk categorization. Apart from that, there are two risks of miscategorization and missing categorization. So yeah, for instance, the Asian Development Bank categorized 102 projects out of the 190, more or less, that they financed during the period of time that we tracked. They categorized 102 projects with a low risk category for indigenous peoples. However, there was at least one recorded case of opposition to a project that they financed, opposition led by indigenous peoples in Indonesia against a geothermal power plant. So yeah, that shows that many times MDBs can also miscategorize projects and therefore fail to apply proper safeguards. There are also many instances in which projects were lacking categorization, for instance, with projects involving financial intermediaries or projects consisting of technical assistance. Out of all 1,510 projects that we tracked from all development banks, about half of these didn't have a risk category assigned. And yeah, which is a great lack of transparency and accountability. The Asian Development Bank is especially lacking from this point of view because they provide a lot of technical assistance project services, and these are not being assigned a risk category. And most often they have big impacts on indigenous banks. Going on, yeah, I will not speak much about examples because there are a lot of examples already here in the panel. Just a couple of projects that we tracked were, for instance, in Laos, wind power plants that were built on indigenous lands by foreign corporations. In this specific case, Monsoon wind power plant. The leading investor was Mitsubishi Corporation, and yeah, the project is located in indigenous lands, and it will be exporting energy to Vietnam through with a transmission line that crosses many more indigenous lands. So, yeah, it's a big, large-scale project implemented by a foreign corporation to export energy, but it's located on indigenous lands. Another similar project is Seykaman hydropower, also in Laos, and also built with the aim to export energy to Vietnam with transmission lines that will impact lands where 90% of the population, of the affected population, is from an ethnic minority, according to the Asian Development Bank. So yeah, according to other reports, of the 61 hydropower dams planned in Laos, most of these are planned for export purposes. So yeah, given this context in which power plants are built and they operate on indigenous territories, they exploit the resources of indigenous peoples, then yeah, who is going to benefit if not the indigenous peoples who live on these territories? Yeah, the tracker that we launched also tracks private companies that receive MDB's money, and many of these companies are headquartered in Europe or United States. There is a map here that you can find on the Energy Finance Tracker, and you can clearly see where companies' headquarters are, and they're not in indigenous territories for sure. And yeah, many of these companies have also been linked to human rights, environmental and human rights abuses. For instance, yeah, in Indonesia, PLN, if I'm not wrong, they entered indigenous territories last October, as recently as last October, forcibly entering indigenous territories. So yeah, we combining the risk of miscategorization, missing categorization, and these companies with shady pasts in terms of impacts on human rights, environmental rights, then yeah, the picture that comes out of this is very sad, hard. Yeah, and I will conclude by zooming in a bit on the Asian Development Bank's operations. What we tracked is that they financed 2 projects that were assigned the highest risk category for indigenous people, impacts on indigenous peoples. These are Dudhkoshi hydropower in Nepal and the Assam solar power in India, and 5 projects that were assigned category B, so medium risk in the Philippines and in India for transmission lines, Indonesia, Nepal for transmission lines. In these cases, even though the risk category is very high and the risk for peoples are very high, the Asian Development Bank is failing to live up to its promises to implement safeguards. So they started, for instance, as a FPIC process in Nepal for the Dudhkoshi hydropower plant, but that showed a lot of flaws, a lot of gaps in accountability and procedural gaps. So that jeopardized, of course, indigenous people's rights that were affected by the construction of the hydropower dam. In another case, for instance, in Sikkim, the Asian Development Bank is financing transmission lines and hydropower development, also through technical assistance projects. Sikkim is a state where in 2023 glacial lake outburst flood destroyed a dam, as well as the lives of people, many thousands of people, and territories. So yeah, the question for the ADB is why, even though it's like decades that these concerns are being raised, why is the bank and other banks still financing these types of projects? So yeah, that's for me. Thanks, Luke.
Thank you, Alessandro. So definitely our development actors, especially multilateral development banks, has a big job to do, no, in terms of shaping up, in terms of improving their policies to ensure that their projects do not contribute to further harms, especially to indigenous peoples. And indigenous peoples actually have the solutions, no, to offer to ensure that projects are not harming indigenous peoples and that projects actually contribute, no, further realize the indigenous people's rights and welfare. So we actually have now Romelisa Halip, no, from Rights for Energy Partnership, Rights to Energy Partnership with indigenous peoples to give us those solutions, no, to give us some examples of solutions being preferred by indigenous people.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivan, and thank you also to fellow indigenous peoples coming from directly affected communities for sharing what's happening on the ground. I was in the session yesterday here in the ADB, annual governors meeting. They were talking about nature and biodiversity, and they were lecturing us on the real world, where the real world is putting a price to everything. Because we raised an issue on, from the perspective of indigenous peoples, the commodification is a no-no. We never commodify nature. That's not how we do nature that's been given to us indigenous peoples. But one speaker mentioned that in the real world, in this world they are in now, you have to put market value to everything. Biodiversity, everything within nature, even the trees, the credits that you get from those trees, you have to put value because that's the real world. But that's not the real world for indigenous peoples. You've heard what's happening from the ground, the impacts of this development, imposed development projects to indigenous peoples without our pre-prior and informed consent. It's causing displacement. It's causing violations against indigenous women's right to livelihood, but also indigenous women who are engaging in defending their land and resources. They're also being subjected to harassment and threats, among other violations that we're experiencing on the ground. But yet we persist as indigenous peoples, because as one of our speakers mentioned, this is not a matter of just us. This is a matter of our continuity as peoples. And if we do not defend our land and resources now, what would the future generations of indigenous peoples live in? So it's not just for today, but the mindset of indigenous peoples in protecting land and resources is for us and for the future generations of indigenous peoples. Now I just like to, before I go to the indigenous land solutions, I just like to zero in on the projects, many of the projects that ADB is funding. These are what we call associated facilities. No? They may not be directly renewable energy projects, but the case of Assam is definitely a renewable energy project. These transmission line facilities are associated facilities because hydropower cannot transmit electricity to other areas without this transmission line. And people are saying that where these transmission lines are running are idle lands. These are lands that are not being used. But what our colleagues are saying here is these are not idle lands, but there's a utilization of these lands by indigenous peoples. It doesn't have to be something that's productive. These forests that we don't touch, these could be watershed areas, these could be sacred areas, these could be areas of cultural significance. These are never idle lands for indigenous peoples, but for the banks and development actors, they see it as non-productive lands and therefore have to be converted to agricultural lands or have to be converted to areas where solar panels, transmission lines, or roads have to be constructed. We have this difference on development perspective from the end of development banks and development actors. You should make the land productive, you should make the land marketable, you should make the land profitable. But from the end of indigenous peoples, we need to take care of the land. We need to sustain this, to sustain our lifeways and to sustain our future generations. There's really that gap of how we view development with the mainstream. Now, in this energy transition, indigenous peoples have been convening together at the global level, at the regional level, to talk about how do we view this just transition? What is just transition for us? Now, the impacts have already been shared by Praveen, but what I would be sharing also would be the recommendations that's coming out from those convenings, because we also had a convening on the certification schemes that are being used by development actors, by companies, to rubber stamp sustainability and human rights compliance. So we also have a declaration on our call for reform for certification schemes. Now, primary recommendation that's coming out from indigenous peoples to really have a just transition is for states to recognize indigenous peoples as distinct peoples with collective rights. Because if that's not there, if there is no legal recognition, as what they are saying, our lands are being taken away and saying that we don't have papers, we don't have that legal document to claim ownership of our land. The second recommendation that's particularly focused to development actors and financial institutions is to ensure that their safeguards are aligned to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the recent General Recommendation 39 of CEDAW that looks at indigenous women's rights. Now, on this one, we're highlighting the need for free, prior, and informed consent, and also human rights due diligence in the safeguards of the banks. The other recommendation for the banks is they have a leverage. They're providing the financing, so they can lead their borrowers and the private sector to align their operations and to align their projects with the respect for indigenous people's rights. They have that power, and we've seen how banks, if they put that as a mandatory requirement to their borrowers and the private sector to ensure respect for indigenous people's rights, they will do it because they are borrowers, or they're borrowing financing from the banks. And the other leverage that banks have is to suspend or defund projects that are causing violations in indigenous people's territories. And that could also happen. There are projects funded by the banks that they were able to suspend because of grave human rights violations to indigenous communities. So in the case of the solar power project in Assam, indigenous peoples are raising their voice here in the ATV AGM, saying that they are being displaced, and this is the place where the bank has to really respond to these directly project-affected communities and act on their demands. Act on their demand to defund or either suspend the project and address the violations that's happening on the ground. And lastly is other grievance mechanism for financial institutions to ensure that there's culturally appropriate and gender-responsive grievance mechanisms. But this is not the only recommendations that we have to address the challenges. Indigenous peoples have always been saying that we have the solutions, and we've always been practicing sustainable solutions in our territories, and we're calling for support for these ones, which are aligned to our values on reciprocity and sustainability. So whether in renewable energy or whether in conservation, we call for support for renewable energy for indigenous-led solutions. It does not have to be large scale. It does not have to put indigenous peoples at risk, when there could also be ways that we could achieve a truly just transition when we support the self-determined development of indigenous peoples. And I stop with that.
Thank you, Romy. We actually had a good amount of time for questions from our participants, from our audience. So I'm seeing Radhika. Who else? Maybe we can start with